morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Well, it's good to see all of you here today. With everything that's going on, we're still not quite back to full capacity, but it's good to see those of you that are here, and I'm sure we've got a lot more folks at home joining us. Matthew 16, 24 through 26 is where we're going to start today. It seems like a lot of work. Would you all agree with that? I've never carried a cross, but that's when we read about it, we read about the struggle Jesus had carrying his. It wasn't a light thing. You know, bearing a cross wasn't a walk in the park. It wasn't meant to be easy. In fact, it was meant to be hard. I'm sure they used larger pieces of wood than they needed to just to make it a little harder. See if I know how to work this. I should have checked first. No, I don't. No, just, yeah. Oh, was that me or you? Yeah, I'm taking credit for it anyway. So today's lesson, I called it Attitudes of Exploration. During this whole quarantine, I don't know if you've noticed, but it's been kind of boring. There's not a lot to do, and so I've started reading again. I haven't read in a while. I've read more books in the past 2 months than in the past 4 years put together, probably, and it's fun. If you don't read, I recommend it. I'd forgotten it. It's enjoyable. So I've started doing that again. And what I've been reading a lot of is like a lot of biographies and autobiographies and nonfiction stuff about like explorers and adventurers back in like late 1800, early 1900s. You know, when the guys, it was mostly the British guys still going out and mapping the world. You know, all the races. You know, who was going to be the first to the North Pole, first to the South Pole, the first to figure out where the Amazon River starts and figure out all these things. They all wanted to be the first. And it's really fascinating to read because these guys had it rough. There was no, helicopter in to the top of the mountain that I want to go to. And no, you took a boat up the river and you got a bunch of donkeys and you started walking. And when the terrain got so bad that the donkeys couldn't go anymore, you just carried it and you set the donkeys loose, and then you were on your own. So I've been reading about like Ernest Shackleton. He wanted to be the first person to walk across Antarctica, and in the process, he got stranded for like a year and a half, and he got stranded for a year and a half, and they were. Like him and his expedition, they were just on a big ice floe. And that was it. There's no radio. You're just there. And they were hoping eventually the ice would break up and they could get out of there. I mean, that's rough. That's uncomfortable. That's hard work. And reading about Percy Fawcett, who was instrumental in mapping the Amazon. You know, back when a lot of South American countries, the terrain was so rough, they didn't know where their borders were. You know, they had a rough map, and they said, oh, somewhere in here is our border. We can't get there. We can't map it, but it's somewhere in here. And so he would go and map these areas. And one of the other guys was John Muir. You guys have probably heard of him. He's sort of instrumental in our national park system. You know, he was I got to read this because he did a lot of stuff. He was a naturalist, author, environmental philosopher, glaciologist, biologist, geologist. I mean, the guy had a resume. He did a lot of stuff. And he's got a quote that some of you have heard, that you just saw it up on the screen. You can go to the next one. And you've probably seen it. Did anybody have this sign hanging in their house? Okay, there we go. No offense. But it doesn't mean what you probably thought it meant. Because we look at this, he said, the mountains are calling and I must go. And yeah, it's on lots of signs. You can see it, in stores that sell little wooden signs to hang up, and we always look at it. When people use it, they say it in like a wistful, it's supposed to be like, well, I want to go on vacation, I want to be in nature, I want to go for a walk on the beach, I want to relax, I want to take it easy. We use this saying as something to get away from work and relax for a while, but that's not what he meant when he said it. Go on to the next one. It came from a letter that he wrote to his sister, September 3rd, 1873. And it's up there, but it's small, so I'll read it to you. He said, "Dear Sister Sarah, I have just returned from the longest and hardest trip I have ever made in the mountains, having been gone over 5 weeks. I am weary, but resting fast, sleepy, but sleeping deep and fast, hungry, but eating much. For 2 weeks, I explored the glaciers of the summits east of here, sleeping among the snowy mountains without blankets and with but little to eat on account of it being so inaccessible. After my icy experiences, it seems strange to be down here in so warm and flowery a climate. I will soon be off again, determined to use all the season in prosecuting my researches. We'll go next to Kings River 100 miles south, then to Lake Tahoe and adjacent mountains, and in winter work in Oakland with my pen. The Scotch are slow, but someday I will have the results of my mountain studies in a form in which you all will be able to read and judge of them. In the meantime, I write occasionally for the Overland Monthly, but neither these magazine articles nor my first book will form any finished part of the scientific contribution that I hope to make. The mountains are calling, and I must go, and I will work on while I can, studying incessantly. So this wasn't a vacation for him. These mountains weren't calling for him to relax. He just got back, he said, from sleeping in the snowy mountains with no blankets and almost nothing to eat. And he was ready to go back. Why? Because he knew that once the seasons changed, he lost his chance. So it didn't matter that he was tired. He could have said, I'm going to take a month or two. That last trip, that was rough. I'm going to take some time and relax, and then I'll go back. No, he said, they're calling me. I've got to go. He said he wanted to make these great scientific contributions. He wanted to learn. He wanted to teach. He wanted to be able to share with people the majesty of the nature that he loved so much. And so he had a mission. He had a calling. And he knew that his time was limited, and he was going to make the most of it. We as Christians have our callings. And I'm going to look at a few of them if you go to the next one. Just 4 quick ones that I'm going to focus on for today. So what are our callings? Love God, love each other, love our enemies, that's sort of part of love each other, and to teach others. Now there's a lot more things that we're called to do, but pretty much everything can be wrapped into those right there. For the first one, love God, Matthew 22:37 on the next slide says, "And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." It's the greatest commandment, right? Love God. Almost everything can be summed up in love God, because if you love God, you love people around you. If you love God, you do right. But we're going to look into it a little more. The next one I mentioned was loving each other. John 13:34 through 35, "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." And then Matthew 22:39 comes right after that last one we talked about. "And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself." We're also told to love our enemies. Matthew 5:44 through 45, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust." And then we're called to teach others. Matthew 28:18 through 20. You should all know this one. "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, to the end of the age." So just like John Muir, who had a calling, his calling was to teach people about nature. His calling was to learn, was to study and share the things that he learned. Those are some of our callings. And I just want you to keep those in mind as we go through here. I told you I called this lesson Attitudes of Exploration because I've been fascinated with these explorers, and I want to look at some of the attitudes that they had that carried them through their work so that we can apply, there we go, so that we can apply those same attitudes to going through with our calling. So there's John Muir. "The mountains are calling, and I must go, and I will work on while I can." He didn't wait for the better time. We talked about that. He went when he was able. When the season was right, he was out there. It doesn't matter if he was tired. He knew he was being called, and so he went. When I was putting this lesson together, reading that, it made me think of a couple verses. Go to the next slide. We've got 1 Corinthians 9:24 and 25. "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. And then 2 Timothy 4:2 says, preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with great patience and instruction. You know, at 1 Corinthians, it talks about runners. I was listening to the radio the other day. They were talking about the Olympics coming up. Apparently, those have been postponed. That's what it sounded like to me. How many of you think that one Olympian got to make that decision? No. It was a big Olympic committee somewhere decided it. See, the people who go to the Olympics, who are trained to run whatever length they do. I like the Winter Olympics better than the summer. I don't know what races they run. 100 meters, 200 meters, mile? I don't know. They run. I don't like running. I don't want to watch other people run. But they don't get to choose when it is. You know, they may say, well, I specialize in the 100 meters, and so that's what they're going to race. And so when they make it to the Olympics, someone from the Olympic committee probably says, all right, well, the 100-meter race is on this day, at this time, in this stadium, and you're going to be in this lane. And then they just make the most of it. They don't get to wake up that day and say, you know, I trained a little too hard last week. I'm kind of sore. Hey, guys, how about we put this off? Let's do this next week. No. And they can't say, you know, I haven't been training hard enough, guys. Let's put this off a few more months. I need to get in better shape. No, they're given a date and a time, and they show up and they give their best. Even if they know that their best isn't going to be good enough. Even if they wake up and say, boy, my legs hurt, I'm not going to be able to run my best, they still have to show up and give their best. And we are sort of in the same situation, except we've got a bit of a disadvantage. See, those Olympic runners, they know when they've got to give their best. They know the date and the time. They say, this is when I'm going to be expected to give 100% and try and win. Just like John Muir, he knew, well, I've got this season. I don't know what season, maybe summer. It's less cold up on the mountains in the summer. You know, there's not as many of those winter storms coming through and blizzards. So he said, I've got this season to do my work. But 2 Timothy, I should have made that up higher, sorry. 2 Timothy says we've got to be ready in season and out of season. Because we as Christians aren't told on, today's the 26th, on July 28th, 2 days from now, Gary, somebody's going to come into your life and they're going to need you to be a good example. And that's going to make a huge difference and that's going to bring them to God. I can't tell you that. I don't know. I can't tell you if you're going to be called to be a godly example today to someone who needs it, or a year from now, or I can't tell you if somebody's going to hear something and say, oh, you go to church? You tell me about it. I can't tell you when that's going to happen, but you've got to be ready. You've got to be ready to give 100% whenever it comes up. Whenever you get the opportunity, you've got to be ready to make the most of it. We can't postpone our work. We can't choose when we're called. We just have to be ready. The next explorer, I already mentioned, if you go, yeah, there we go, Ernest Shackleton. That looks like an explorer, doesn't he? He just looks like a tough guy. He said, the world is a huge place. How will you know where you fit in unless you explore beyond your comfort zone? I told you a little bit about him at the beginning. This guy, he wanted to be, somebody had already been the first one at the South Pole. He missed out on that one. He was hoping to do it, but he got beat. So he said, I'm going to be the first person to walk across Antarctica. That's what I'm going to do. Why? It sounds, that is the dumbest goal ever, I think. But hey, he wanted to be the first one to walk all the way across it. So he got, I forgot to look up how many, but a shipload of men. That was part of his expedition. And they got ready, and they had dogs, and they had sleds, and they had just tons of food. And they get down there, and as they're getting close, you know, if you get down to Antarctica, there's big ice floes. Just like big hunks of ice, basically, that float around and drift around. And their ship got stuck in between a bunch of them. This big field of ice floes closed in on their ship. And at that point, you just sit there. You know, you can't plow through it. They had a sailboat. They were just going with the wind and where the water took them. And they got stuck. And the ice, you know, you're talking about ice as far as the eye can see. And it closed in, and it crushed their ship. And luckily, they were able to get a bunch of stuff off of it before that happened. And they had a couple lifeboats, like 20-foot long lifeboats. But they got those off, and they started walking. And they took the boats with them, not through the water, because there was ice everywhere. They pulled, these boats belong behind them, and they pulled all their food, and they had the dogs and the sleds to help them. And for a year and a half, his crew was trapped down there. You know, they would walk for a while, and then the ice floes would separate, and they'd be stuck on a big hunk of ice for a while. And eventually the floes would close back up, and they'd be able to walk longer. And eventually they got on this big glacier, more or less, and they were getting low on food, and there's no radios, there's no cell phones, there's no helicopters. It's just them with what they had with them. And so Ernest Shackleton here, he and 3 other guys took one of those 20-foot boats, and they disassembled another boat to make like a little roof over their boat, and they set off heading somewhere. They didn't know exactly where, because they didn't know exactly where they were. You know, this ice has just pushed them all over the place, but they got some pretty good ideas, and so they go off on this ship. And it took them about a month, these 4 guys on this tiny 20-foot boat through some of the most dangerous waters in the world. And then they get to South Georgia Island, and they land on the wrong side. They don't land near where the people live. They've got to cross this island and these mountains and these big glaciers, and they have 50 feet of rope for these 4 guys, and an adze, like a chopping tool, kind of like a hoe, sort of. And they cross these mountains, and they get to civilization. And they say, hey, we left our crew back here. We've got to get back there. And to demonstrate how dangerous the waters were that they came through on this little 20-foot lifeboat that was barely big enough for them to sit up straight, it took them 4 tries with specially designed ice boats and professional, you know, crews that sailed those waters. It took them 4 tries to get back to his crew to pick them up. The next person that crossed South Georgia Island with the route he did was a crew of professional climbers. They did it about 50 years later, I think, with more modern equipment and more well-prepared, and they said what they did was impossible. And the only way they did it was because they had no other choice. And I tell you all this to tell you that this guy knows what it means to step outside of your comfort zone. He knows what it's like to be uncomfortable. I would say he probably knows what it's like to be miserable. And yet he said, how do you know where you fit into this world unless you explore past your comfort zone? God expects the same out of us. He expects us to leave our comfort zone sometimes. 2 Timothy 1:77. Is that right? We'll see. Somebody look that up. That seems like a lot of verses, but for God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. And then Romans 8:31 says, what then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? See, we're not meant to be a scared people. God expects us to step outside of our comfort zone. He expects us to push ourselves beyond what we want to do. We're meant to be a people of power and discipline, not scared people who say, well, I'd like to talk to that guy over there about church, but what if he says no? I just won't do it. You know, I'd like to do this thing or sign up to help with this activity, but I've never done it before, and it makes me nervous, so I'm just not going to do it. We're not meant to be scared, and why should we be scared? Romans 8:31, if God is with us, who can stand against us? We're meant to step out on faith because we know that we're not alone when we do it. We're not stepping out on faith by ourselves. We've got God there. We might not always be successful, but we'll never be alone. Next guy I want to talk about is Percy Fawcett. There's another one. That guy looks like he's explored some stuff. He's got the explorer hat, got the khaki shirt. He looks like a guy who's gone some places. And he said, you need not have any fear of failure. He wrote that in a telegraph to his wife. And just so we're all clear, that was the last telegraph he ever sent, and he disappeared in the Amazon. He's dead now. He was killed by a tribe that lived there in the Amazon. That's failure, I guess, if you're trying to explore and you die there, and I think that's failure. And yet he was never afraid of failure. See, he made his name exploring the Amazon, and I told you earlier, the governments, the countries at that time weren't really sure where their borders were. They weren't sure who all lived deep in the jungle in their countries. There were these uncontacted tribes and rivers that they didn't know exactly where they went, and just dense jungle that people couldn't go through. And at the time, lots of people were trying to explore it, and lots of people died or disappeared. In fact, Percy Fawcett was somewhat famous because he would just walk into the jungle, and behind him he'd have a whole crew of people, and the longer they went, his crew would get malaria and all these sorts of diseases, and they'd get sick and they'd get infections, and it never bothered him. There was something about him. He just wasn't susceptible to that stuff. And the people were always so amazed. And there was another time that his people in his expedition, the ones that survived one expedition, they wrote about him. They were going down this river in their canoes, and on one side of the river, this tribe of people that had never been contacted before, they started shooting arrows at them. And so they did the smart thing and went to the opposite side of the river. They got out of the canoes, went into the woods, and they thought, we got to get back in the boats and keep going down the river. So they started getting their rifles ready, and they were going to shoot back. And he told his men, no, we're not going to do that. We're never going to survive if we start killing everybody that we come across and getting into little battles with every tribe that we come across. And so his men all got down, and they hid behind the canoes, and they hid behind trees. And he walked out into the river. He didn't take a rifle with him. He didn't have anything to hide behind. He just started walking across the river. He took I believe it was a scarf he took off and was waving it above his head. And they kept shooting arrows at him. He kept walking, waving. And he got up, and the river was relatively deep. He got up to his head, so there's nothing he could do, but he just kept walking. And he walked right across the other side and made contact with these people and gave them some gifts, and they started a dialogue. And everyone was amazed because that's not how it was done back then. Back in, I can't remember the exact year, early 1900s is when he did this. If you're exploring the jungle and you come across people you don't know, a lot of times they would just kill them. They'd say, well, they're, savages was the word they used back then. They're not like us, so we've got to protect ourselves. But no, he said, these people live here. We're exploring their land. I'm going to learn from them. I'm going to make contact with them. I'm going to make friendships with them. And so he would just walk through this storm of arrows coming at him just to make contact, just to live up to the code that he had set for himself. I might die out here, but I'm not going to kill out here. That was sort of the code that he had. And he was famous because he could do things that no one else could. These tribes would help him. They'd teach him things. They'd show him where to go. He was a fearless man. You need not have any fear of failure, is what he told his wife. And then he was never heard from again. And he knew that was going to, he had to have known that every time he walked into that jungle, he was much more likely to die than to live through that journey. Thousands of people. There would be expeditions of hundreds of people that would go through because they figured the more people we have, the more supplies we can take, and 90% of them would die. And a few stragglers would make their way out. So he knew that eventually he was going to die in that jungle. He had to have known. He was a smart guy. But he didn't have any fear of it. We're given a similar example in the Bible in 2 Timothy 4, 6 through 8. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Finally, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day. And not to me only, but also to all who have loved his appearing. We shouldn't have any fear of failure because as Christians, as long as we're doing what we can, we're doing our part and living our best life, there is no failure. We know what comes next. I think everyone in here knows this. We're all going to die. That's not a question. If you didn't realize that, I'm sorry. This must be a heartbreaking moment for you, but you're going to die at some point. And you might die late in life after you've done everything that you wanted to do. Everything that you were called to do, you did it. And then you die, and guess what? You did good work. Heaven's waiting. Or you might die a lot sooner than you wanted, and you haven't gotten to do much. You had a lot of stuff left to do, and you had callings that you hadn't fulfilled, but guess what? You did what you were supposed to do. You tried. You worked towards pleasing God and doing what you need to do in this life, and so heaven is waiting. There is no failing for us, so there should be no need, no fear of failure. We know that when our time comes, there's something better coming up next. We've got one more verse for us, Galatians 6:9. And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. Those are just three guys that I wanted to tell you about, three explorers, and one thing they all had in common was they didn't give up. Even when things were hard, even when things were uncomfortable, even when things were impossible, they kept working. They stepped out on faith. They gave it their best shot, and they did what they were meant to do. That's what we have to do. And it gets hard. And there's times when loving our enemies is rough. There's times when teaching others can be hard. We're tired and we see an opportunity out in the world to teach somebody, and I'm just tired. Maybe I don't want to do that today. I can always do it another day. But we can't give up. We can't grow weary. We have a calling as Christians, and it's our job, it's our duty to follow through with it. Because life is hard. Following those callings are hard. Living life according to God's will can be hard sometimes. It's a lot easier to just give up, go with the flow, and do what we want to do. But just remember, don't grow weary of doing good. Because there's something coming up after this. As long as we put in the work, we have a reward waiting. We're going to sing a song now, and while we do, if there's anything that we can do, come let us know. If you have needs, let us know about it. If maybe you haven't been living a fearless life, if you haven't been stepping outside of your comfort zone, let us know. Let us know that if there's something that we can do to help you. Or maybe you've stepped out of your comfort zone. You've been teaching. You've been following through with those callings, but lately you've just gotten a little tired. It's been a weird couple of months, and people are worn down and tired and scared and exhausted, and that's okay. Maybe you've slowed down with what you know you should be doing because it's just there's been a lot on your plate, and that's okay. Let us know. Let us know that we can pray for you, and let us know what we can do to help you, and most of all, let God know that you haven't given up. Let God know that you're saying, I'm not going to get weary. I'm going to follow through. God, I know what you want me to do, and I am going to do it. So if there's anything that we can do for you today, if you have any needs,